The man standing near the dessert table didn't look like anyone's idea of a hero. Worn blazer, scuffed boots, a paper napkin folded in his breast pocket because he didn't own a handkerchief. He was holding a small plate of chocolate truffles he hadn't eaten yet, saving them for his daughter, who was sitting beside him pretending not to be bored at a party full of adults who smelled like expensive things. Then 6 men walked through the ballroom doors with rifles, and Ronan Hale stopped being invisible. If that opening just made your pulse jump, good. That means you're exactly who this story was made for. Welcome back to the channel. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is the kind of story that will keep you up at night, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Smash the like button if you love stories about people the world underestimates. And drop a comment below telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's find out together. Now, let's go back to that ballroom. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday. Ronan found it wedged between an electric bill and a coupon flyer for the pizza place 3 blocks away, which was the kind of company it deserved, he thought. It was a thick cream envelope with embossed lettering and a wax seal, and for a long moment he just stood at the kitchen counter holding it, flour from the bread he'd been making still on his hands. You are cordially invited to the Blackwood Foundation annual charity gala. It read, Blackwood Grand Hotel, Saturday, 7 p.m. Black tie preferred. He read it twice. Then he turned it over, looking for some explanation on the back, some note that said sorry, wrong address. There wasn't one. What's that? Lily asked from the kitchen table without looking up from her homework. Nothing, Ronan said, which was his default answer for things he hadn't processed yet. You're making that face. What face? The face where something's weird, and you're deciding whether to tell me. She finally looked up. She was 9 years old and had her mother's eyes, the sharp, assessing kind that made adults feel transparent. Is it something bad? No? He set the invitation on the counter. It's an invitation to a fancy party. Lily stared at him. For you? Thanks, he said flatly. She grinned and went back to her homework, but she was still smiling when she looked back down at the page, and that almost made him feel better about the whole thing. Push. The invitation had come through his employer, a mid-sized construction firm called Barton and Associates that had been quietly contracted for renovation work on the east wing of the Blackwood Grand over the past 14 months. The project manager, a compact, nervous man named Delgado, had pulled Ronan aside on Thursday morning and explained that the hotel's event coordinator had offered a block of complimentary tickets to the crew as a gesture of goodwill. Most of the guys don't want to go, Delgado said. Too far, wrong crowd, whatever. But I thought you might, I don't know. You've got a kid. The ticket covers a +1 or a family member. Ronan had looked at him. It's a fundraiser for pediatric oncology research, Delgado added, like that settled something. It did, a little. Lily had been asking to see the inside of the hotel for months, ever since she'd caught a glimpse of the lobby chandelier through the service entrance while waiting for Ronan to clock out. She'd described it for 3 straight days. It looked like a million pieces of ice just hanging in the air, Dad, like someone froze a waterfall. So on Saturday evening, Ronan ironed the blue blazer he'd worn to 2 job interviews and 1 funeral, polished his work boots because he didn't own dress shoes, and told Lily she could wear the green dress with the silver button she'd been saving for a special occasion she never specified. She came out of her room and did a slow spin in the hallway. How do I look? Like someone who belongs at a charity gala, Ronan said. She narrowed her eyes at him. How do I actually look? Perfect, he said. And that one he meant. The Blackwood Grand Hotel occupied an entire city block on Meridian Avenue, the kind of building that made you feel smaller just by existing. Ronan stood outside it for a moment before they went in, hands loose at his sides, running a quiet assessment the way he still did with any new space. Exits, sightlines, structural bottlenecks. Old habit. Useless habit, he told himself, and pushed through the revolving door. Inside, it was everything Lily had promised and then some. The chandelier alone was worth the trip. She stopped walking the moment she saw it and craned her neck back so far, Ronan put a hand on her shoulder to keep her from stumbling. The ballroom ceiling stretched 40 feet above them, and the chandelier cascaded down from its center like a slow explosion of light. Thousands of crystal drops catching the gold of the room below and throwing it back in pieces. "I told you," Lily breathed. "You told me," he agreed. She grabbed his hand and dragged him forward. The crowd was approximately 500 people, and Ronan understood within the first 5 minutes that he was a different kind of guest than everyone else in the room. That wasn't self-pity. It was just fact. He was used to reading rooms, and this one was easy. Men in tuxedos that fit them the way clothes only fit people who'd spent real money on them. Women in dresses that had names he wouldn't recognize. Waitstaff gliding between clusters of conversation with trays of things he couldn't price but knew were expensive. Everyone had a reason to be here, that they were happy to announce. He'd overheard 4 different people explain their companies in the first 10 minutes near the entrance, and each explanation had that particular rhythm of a person who'd said it many times and enjoyed saying it. Ronan found them a position near the dessert table. Not because of the desserts, though Lily immediately identified the chocolate truffles and looked at him with a specific expression he recognized as calculated negotiation. 2, he said preemptively. "I was going to say 3. 2. Fine, 2 and a macaron. Deal." He handed her the plate and let her build her selections while he turned his attention back to the room. Slow visual sweep, left to right. Main entrance, double doors, propped open, 2 hotel security stationed on either side, neither of them paying close attention. Side corridor at the far left, leading toward what he'd identified as the kitchen service hall. A smaller door at the back right, currently closed, likely a fire exit based on placement. The stage at the north wall where a string quartet was setting up. 2 camera operators from what appeared to be a local news station near the left flank. He noted the marble pillars running in 2 rows down the length of the room. Heavy. Structural. Good cover. Stop doing that, he told himself. He took a truffle off Lily's plate. "Hey." "Tax," he said. She gave him a look of profound grievance and redirected her attention to the macarons. He first noticed Victoria Sterling at approximately 8 o'clock, and not because she stood out in the way he'd later be told she was supposed to. She stood out because she was the only person in the room who looked genuinely tired. Everyone else in the VIP section near the stage was performing some version of ease, laughing too smoothly, listening with too much attentiveness, existing in that particular way that people do when they know they're being watched and have decided to be okay with it. Victoria was among them, but not exactly of them. She stood with her posture correct and her expression polite, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't drunk from, and every 30 seconds or so, her eyes moved to the main entrance with a small, controlled tension that most people probably missed. Ronan didn't miss it. She was 30, he'd guess, dark hair pinned up with a precision that probably required help. A black dress that was clearly expensive and clearly chosen by someone who understood what it meant to dress for authority rather than attention. She was listening to a man in a silver-gray suit tell her something enthusiastic, and her response was professional enough that the man didn't notice she'd checked the door again while he was mid-sentence. He'd looked her up after the gala, but at the time he just filed her away as careful, alert. Someone with something on her mind that the evening wasn't letting her address. Later, he'd understand why. Around 8:30, a foundation representative took the stage to introduce the evening's speakers and outline the year's fundraising goals. The guests drifted toward the seating area. Lily had found a girl approximately her age near the dessert table, and they were in deep negotiation about something involving the macaron selection and a shared opinion about the string quartet's tempo choices. Ronan stayed near the pillar. A man stopped beside him, 50s, silver-haired, the satisfied weight of someone accustomed to being deferred to. He glanced at Ronan's boots with an expression that was too quick to be called rude, but was definitely categorizing. "Contractor?" the man said, not unkindly, more like identifying. "Yeah," Ronan said. "Which firm?" "Barton and Associates. We did the East Wing renovation." The man nodded the way people nod when they're done with information. "Lovely work," he said, already turning away. "Lovely." Ronan watched him go. He wasn't offended. He understood what he was here. He was the type of presence that made a gala feel democratic, the token proof that these tables were open to anyone, which they weren't really, but the gesture mattered to the people who made it. He was furniture that could hold a fork. He'd been that before. It didn't bother him the same way it once had, when he was 23 and his rank meant nothing outside a base. He'd learned to understand what rooms were actually measuring you against, and he'd learned not to let those measurements mean much. Still, it was a long evening to be standing near a pillar. "Dad?" Lily appeared beside him, her new acquaintance in tow. "This is Emma. Her dad is the one who donated the chandelier. I told her you work in construction, and she wants to know how chandeliers are hung." Emma was 7 or 8, gap-toothed and serious, with the firm confidence of a child who had never been ignored. "Is it very complicated?" she asked him. "Because my dad says it took 6 engineers, and I want to know if that's too many." Ronan crouched down to her level. "Depends on the chandelier," he said. "Something that size, 6 is probably about right. You want to be careful with the load distribution. That's how much weight each anchor point is holding. If you get that wrong, it falls," Emma said with grim appreciation. "In the worst case, yeah. Has one ever fallen on someone?" "Not that I know of." She considered this. But it could. Technically, a lot of things could. Emma seemed to find this philosophically interesting and went quiet. Lily gave Ronan a look that said she'd known they would get along. He stood back up, and for the first time that evening, something close to ease moved through him. Nothing about this room fit him, and he'd stopped pretending it did, and there was a freedom in that. He didn't know that in approximately 19 minutes, the room would stop fitting everyone else too. The first thing he heard was the doors. Not an explosion, not shouting, just the specific wrong sound of doors coming open when they shouldn't. The main entrance, both panels, and then the side corridor access simultaneously. The sound was underneath the applause from the stage, which was why it took the room nearly 4 seconds to understand what was happening. Ronan understood in one. He had Lily by the arm before anyone else in their section had turned their head. Not rough, not running, controlled, with the particular speed of someone who has rehearsed emergency movement so many times it stopped being thought and became reflex. "Come here," he said quietly. "Dad." "Now, Lily." She came. He moved them to the second column from the left. Structural pillar, thick marble, positioned between 2 of the entrances rather than directly in line with either. He set her back against it and crouched in front of her so they were eye level. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was the same voice he used for bedtime and grocery lists and everything else. Calm, unhurried. "I need you to stay right here and not move. Get as low as you can and keep your back to the pillar. Don't watch what's happening. Focus on the floor." Lily's eyes were wide, but she wasn't panicking. She was listening, the way she always listened when he used that particular tone. "What is it?" "I don't know yet. Could be nothing." That was a lie, and they both understood it was a lie, but it was the right kind of lie. "If you hear me tell you to run, you run for the back exit, the door at the right corner. Don't stop and don't look back. You understand?" "Where will you be?" He looked at her. "Dad, where will you be?" "Right here," he said. "I'll be right here." He straightened up and turned around. There were 6 of them. They came in from 3 points, 2 through the main entrance, 2 from the side corridor, 2 from what must have been a secondary access behind the stage that he hadn't identified. They were dressed in clothes that would have passed as hotel staff at a distance, but the rifles changed that math immediately. Not handguns. Rifles. Compact and modified, and the men carrying them moved with the deliberate spacing of people who had practiced the layout. This was not a robbery of opportunity. The screaming started about 3 seconds after the guns became visible. And then the rushing towing, guests trying to surge toward exits, toward phones, toward anywhere that wasn't here. One of the men fired a single shot into the ceiling. The plaster burst and dust sifted down, and the sound rolled through the ballroom like a hand slamming a table. The room went almost completely still. "Nobody is leaving," said the man in the center. He was maybe 45. Broad, with a flat affect, and the kind of patience that didn't come from being naturally calm. It came from being someone who had learned that slowness intimidates. He wore his authority like it was a material fact, something he'd already proven and didn't need to reprove. His gaze moved across the crowd methodically, the way you scan a space you already control. Ronan watched him from behind a cluster of guests who had instinctively pressed together near his pillar. He was quiet, studying the leader's eye movement, where he looked first, second, third. Watching the other 5 men, their spacing, their trigger discipline, the direction their barrels were pointing. Noting who was near a phone, who had moved toward exits, who was crying, and who was silent. The leader looked across the crowd, and his eyes landed on Ronan. Not randomly, specifically, because Ronan was the only person in his sightline who wasn't covering his face, gripping another person, or staring at the ceiling where the shot had gone. Ronan was looking directly back at him with an expression that wasn't defiance and wasn't fear. It was just attention. The leader tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when something catches his notice. Ronan recognized the moment. He'd been in rooms like this before, not ballrooms, not chandeliers, different furniture entirely, but the geometry of it was familiar. A man with power looking for a fixed point in a crowd of chaos, looking for something to demonstrate his authority against. Looking, Ronan understood with a cold clarity for the wrong target. Lily was behind him, her back against the marble. He could feel her presence without turning around. He exhaled slowly and let his shoulders drop, made himself softer in posture than he felt. Smaller, less interesting, the kind of man who poses no complications and solves no problems. Too late. The leader had already chosen. "You," the man said, and pointed directly at Ronan. "Step forward." The crowd parted slightly, the way crowds do when someone else gets selected. Relief on some faces, guilt underneath the relief. A few people looked at Ronan with expressions that said they were sorry and were already moving past the sorry. Ronan stepped forward. He moved slowly, hands visible at his sides, keeping his eyes on the leader's face rather than his weapon. He was aware of everything in the room without looking at any of it directly, a technique he'd been taught in a program whose name he wasn't supposed to remember and had never entirely forgotten. The leader watched him approach. Something in the man's expression adjusted. Not concern, but a recalibration. He'd expected the ordinary thing, the flinching and sweating and begging, the stuff that made authority feel solid. What he was getting instead was a man who looked like he was walking through an ordinary room. That wasn't what the leader had planned for. He hadn't had a chance to think about what it meant yet. He would. But not tonight. Tonight, he still believed he was in control. "What's your name?" the leader said. "Ronan," he said. "Ronan Hale." "What do you do, Ronan Hale?" "Construction." The leader looked him over. The blazer, the boots, the absence of anything that marked him as significant in the economy of this room. And he smiled, brief and confident, like a man who has just confirmed his own assessment. "Good," Victor Kane said. "Then you'll do exactly what I tell you." Ronan held his gaze and said nothing. And somewhere behind a marble pillar to his left, a 9-year-old girl with her mother's sharp eyes was already counting exits. Victor Kane had not planned for someone like Ronan Hale. That wasn't something Victor would have admitted to himself yet. He was still in the phase where everything was proceeding according to what he'd mapped out over 4 months of careful preparation. 6 men, 3 entry points, 500 guests, 1 target. The math had been simple. The execution had been clean, and now he had the room, which meant he had control, which meant he had time. What he didn't have, standing 12 feet from the construction worker with the flat, unhurried eyes, was the particular kind of certainty he usually felt when he'd already won. He filed that away and chose not to look at it. "Here's what's going to happen," Victor said, loud enough for the first 3 rows of guests to hear, pitched to carry without shouting. He had a good voice for this, calm, measured, the voice of someone explaining something that's already been decided. "Everyone is going to sit down. You're going to put your phones on the floor in front of you, face down. And you're going to stay quiet while my associates collect some things we need. This will take approximately 40 minutes. If nobody does anything that forces me to change my timeline, everyone walks out of here without a mark on them." The room didn't exactly believe him, but 500 people in formal wear with rifles pointed at them don't need to believe a man to comply with him. They need to believe that not complying is worse, and that part he'd already established. People sat. Phones came out. Victor watched it happen with the satisfaction of someone whose system is working. He turned his attention back to Ronan. "You're going to stand right here," he said, "right where I can see you. You understand?" "Yeah," Ronan said. "Good." One of Victor's men, the heavy-set one near the right pillar, who Ronan had clocked as probably the least disciplined of the six, based on the way he kept shifting his grip, started moving through the seated guests, collecting phones in a canvas bag. Another had positioned himself near the main doors, which were now secured with what looked like a hydraulic bar brace. Professional equipment, not the kind of thing you picked up same day. Ronan stood where he'd been told to stand and watched all of it without appearing to watch any of it. He was counting things. It was automatic now, the way breathing was automatic. He didn't decide to do it, it just happened. He was counting seconds between each man's sweeps, counting the gaps in coverage when two of them crossed paths, counting the distance between himself and the nearest structural obstacle. He was tracking Victor's eye movement and what it told him about where Victor felt most exposed. He was also thinking about Lily. She was behind the second pillar on the left. He hadn't looked back at her since he'd stepped forward, because looking at her would tell Victor that she mattered, and the most important thing right now was that Victor didn't know what mattered to him. But he could feel the distance between them the way you feel weather. In his chest, something low and persistent. "Stay down," he thought. "Don't look. Don't move." She was smart enough. She was scared enough to listen. He hoped. Victoria Sterling had not panicked, which surprised the three people closest to her who knew what her company was worth, and had assumed, incorrectly, that wealth softened people's reflexes in a crisis. She'd spent her first 30 seconds making two assessments: the number of armed men in their positions, and the probability that this was random versus targeted. The probability that it was random dropped to near zero at the 31-second mark, when the man she'd identified as the leader finished his announcement and his eyes moved immediately, without any apparent search, to the far corner of the room where her company's legal counsel was seated. He knew exactly where to look, which meant he had a floor plan, a guest list, or both. Which meant this had been planned around someone specific, and Victoria was a practical woman who had spent 10 years making decisions under conditions where being wrong had real consequences, so she didn't spend much time on the possibility that the specific person wasn't her. She kept her face neutral and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at the man who'd been pulled from the crowd to stand near the leader. She didn't know him. Worn blazer, work boots, the kind of physical stillness that didn't read as calm so much as managed, like stillness that had been trained into him rather than come naturally. She noticed that he was looking at the armed men the way she looked at a spreadsheet, not reacting to it, processing it. He noticed her noticing. His eyes moved to her for exactly 1 second, then away. She filed him away and turned her attention back to the man with the flat voice. Victor's name, Ronan would learn later. Right now he was just the leader, which was enough. Around the 12-minute mark, one of the guests made a mistake. He was a man in his 60s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who'd spent most of his life being the largest person in a room and hadn't fully updated his threat calculus to account for firearms. He was seated near the stage, and he'd apparently decided, somewhere in the interval between 12 and 13 minutes, that the moment one of Victor's men turned his back was a moment worth using. He stood up. The room saw it happening before the armed man did, and the room collectively stopped breathing. "Hey," the older man said. His voice was shaking, but he was standing. "Hey, I want to know what you people think you're—" The nearest of Victor's men had him by the collar before he finished the sentence, and the impact of hitting the floor was loud enough that several of the women near the front gasped and covered their mouths. Victor didn't move. He watched the man get dragged back to his seat with the expression of someone watching a mildly inconvenient thing resolve itself. "I said sit down," Victor said to the room, not shouting, just clarifying. "The next person who decides to be a hero is going to make the next 40 minutes significantly less pleasant for everyone around them." The word hero landed in the room like something physical. Ronan didn't react, but he noticed something shift in Victor's posture after that. A small adjustment, barely visible. The kind that meant the incident had cost Victor something. Not confidence exactly, just the smoothness of the timeline. A thing that wasn't supposed to happen had happened, and now Victor was compensating. And compensation always costs. He filed that away too. It was around the 20-minute mark that Victor began to figure out there was something wrong with his construction worker. Most people, when forced to stand in place at gunpoint in a crowded room, do a predictable set of things. They sweat. They glance at their phone. They watch the men with guns in a way that telegraphs exactly how frightened they are. They try to make themselves smaller. Ronan had barely moved. His breathing was even. He wasn't watching the armed men frantically. He was watching them the way you watch traffic when you're very experienced at crossing streets. His hands hadn't gone into his pockets, which meant he wasn't hiding anything, but they also weren't doing the nervous fidgeting things that hands usually did in situations like this. Victor came to stand beside him, not close enough to be threatening, more the way a man sidled up alongside someone at a bar, like they were both just standing there by coincidence. "You're not scared," Victor said, conversational, testing something. "I'm a little scared," Ronan said, which was technically true. Fear was information. He'd learned that a long time ago. Fear didn't mean what civilians thought it meant. It wasn't an enemy. It was data. Victor studied the side of his face. "What kind of construction do you do?" "General, framing, finishing, some mechanical when they need it." "How long?" 8 years. "Before that?" Ronan looked at him. "Before that I was younger," he said. Victor almost smiled, not warmly. "Where'd you serve?" The question landed without preamble, and for a fraction of a second, less than a second really, just the pause between one breath and the next, Ronan's eyes changed. Victor saw it. "I didn't say I served," Ronan said. "No," Victor agreed. "You didn't." He looked back at the room. "You stand like someone who served. You breathe like someone who's been trained to breathe a specific way under pressure, and you're the only person in this room who hasn't once looked at a phone or an exit." He paused. "You already know where the exits are." Ronan said nothing. It was the wrong thing to do, staying quiet. He understood that as soon as he'd done it. He should have pushed back, given some deflection, constructed a small argument. The silence confirmed what Victor was already building toward. Victor looked at him with the particular expression of a man recalculating. "Interesting," he said, and walked away. Victoria had been watching the exchange from 40 feet away and couldn't hear it, but she could read the geometry of it. The leader had been testing the construction worker, and based on the way the leader walked away, something had shifted. She made a decision. Getting to her feet with 3 armed men in the room required judgment she wasn't completely certain she had, but staying seated and watching things develop wasn't a strategy. It was just waiting, which was the thing she'd always been worst at. She raised her hand. One of Victor's men, the one nearest the aisle, looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected anyone to raise a hand. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge," she said. Her voice was steady. Years of board presentations in rooms full of people who expected her to fail had built a particular kind of steadiness in her, and she pulled on it now. The man with the rifle looked at Victor. Victor turned around. He looked at Victoria Sterling the way he had not looked at anyone else in the room, with recognition and something that might have been satisfaction if you were being uncharitable about it, which she was. He walked over. "Miss Sterling," he said. So that answered that. "You know who I am?" she said. "I know quite a lot about you," he said. "That's why we're here." She kept her face even. "Then you know that whatever you're trying to leverage, the company, the assets, the projects, threatening 500 uninvolved people is a very slow way to get there. Let them go. Keep me. Whatever you need from Nexus, you work through me, not through a ballroom full of people who have nothing to do with it." Victor looked at her with something she could only describe as appreciation. The way someone appreciates an opponent who plays well even when playing badly would have been easier. "That's a generous offer," he said. "It's a practical one." "It is," he agreed, "but here's my problem." He glanced back toward where Ronan was standing. "I've already got someone who's more useful to me right now, and I don't like to change systems mid-operation." Victoria frowned, the logic not catching up fast enough. "He's a construction worker." Maybe, Victor said. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Possibly. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Ronan. Sit back down, Ms. Sterling. I'll come back to you. She sat back down. She didn't have a better option in that moment, which was a feeling she deeply hated, and she held on to that hatred because it was cleaner than fear and more useful than grief. Ronan became aware of the shift in Victor's focus around the 26th minute. It wasn't anything said aloud. Victor was still directing his men with economy, small gestures and brief murmurs, the operation still moving forward on its internal logic. But 2 of the 6 had stopped their sweep of the guests and repositioned. 1 near the main door, 1 near the stage, both of them angled to cover a wider radius. Covering a wider radius meant covering against someone who might try to move through the room, someone who wasn't seated. Someone like Ronan. He understood what was happening. Victor was tightening the net because he didn't know what Ronan was, and not knowing what something was, in Victor's line of work, was its own kind of threat. The question was whether Victor would make a move before Ronan could. The answer came in the 31st minute, when Victor walked back over to him and said, quietly enough that only Ronan could hear it clearly, "I'm going to need you to come with me." "Where?" "Toward the back. I want to show you something." "That's not how this usually works," Ronan said. "You don't show things to guests." "You're not a guest," Victor said. "Not really." He let that sit for a second. "I did some checking. You were on a list." "What list?" "The hotel renovation crew. Full access to the East Wing for 14 months. Victor's voice was still conversational, still the register of a man explaining obvious things. "You know this building better than most of the security staff." Ronan looked at him. "I want to know what you know about the East Wing service corridor access," Victor said. "Specifically, the maintenance tunnel that runs under the ballroom to the north utility room." So that was it. That was why he'd been selected. Not because Victor had made him his former military, or not only that, Victor needed someone with structural knowledge of the building, a guide, a key that moved on 2 legs. The military suspicion was a secondary layer. The building knowledge was the primary utility. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ronan said. Victor looked at him patiently. "I think you do." Maintenance tunnel under the ballroom, East Wing. That's right. Big hotel like this, there's probably 8 or 9 access tunnels under the ballroom level, Ronan said. "I wouldn't know which one you mean without a schematic." "Then we'll go look at a schematic. Or," Ronan said, "you let these people go and we skip all of this." Victor's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. The small, tired shift of a man who has heard this kind of appeal before and has already decided it costs him nothing. "Bring the girl," Victor said. Not to Ronan, to someone behind Ronan. Ronan turned around. One of Victor's men was standing beside Lily's pillar. He hadn't seen him move there, hadn't heard it, which meant the man had repositioned during the 31st minute exchange as a deliberate setup, which meant this moment had been planned before Victor came to stand beside him. Lily was on her feet. Her face was the tight, controlled expression of someone working very hard not to show fear. She was looking at Ronan with the specific intensity of a child who needed to be told what to do. Everything in Ronan's body changed. Not visibly. Nothing moved on the outside. Nothing shifted in his face that Victor could have read and used. But internally, below the surface of the careful management, something older and much less patient came up from whatever compartment he'd spent 8 years building for it. He turned back to Victor. "She's 9 years old," Ronan said. His voice was the same as it had been all evening, even, unhurried. "She has nothing to do with this building or your operation or anything you need." "No," Victor agreed, "but she has everything to do with you." He tilted his head slightly. "So, the service corridor. Are we going to look at a schematic, or are we going to have a different kind of conversation?" The room was watching. Not everyone, most people were staring at the floor, at their hands, at the middle distance of people trying to take up less space. But some of them were watching, including Victoria Sterling, who had gone very still in her chair and was looking at the man in the worn blazer with an expression she hadn't yet named for herself. Ronan looked at Lily. She was still looking at him with that tight wound attention, waiting for a signal. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough to see her get it. The infinitesimal adjustment in his expression, the thing that wasn't words, but that she, who had been reading his face since she was 4 years old, understood to mean, I know, I see you. Hold on. He turned back to Victor. Okay, he said. I'll show you the corridor. Victor studied him. Just like that. She's my daughter, Ronan said. So, yeah, just like that. Victor nodded slowly, with the careful satisfaction of a man who believes he has just found the lever that moves the heavy thing. He was right that he'd found the lever. He was wrong about what happened when you used it. Waltz. They moved toward the back of the ballroom, Victor and Ronan and 2 of Victor's men, with Lily walking between them in her green dress with the silver buttons. Her shoes clicked on the marble floor with a small, precise sound that Ronan tracked without looking back at her. He was building something in his head. Not a plan exactly. Plans were fragile, too dependent on cooperation from a situation that wasn't going to cooperate. What he was building was more like a map of the next 30 seconds, and the 30 seconds after that, laid over what he knew of the building, laid over what he'd assessed about the 6 men in terms of skill and discipline and spacing. The man behind him on the right had his rifle shouldered too high, compensating for something, so probably a training issue, not enough time behind the weapon. A man whose rifle is shouldered too high loses 0.2 of a second bringing it to bear at close range. 0.2 of a second was a very long time. The second man on the left was more careful. Experienced, probably. Kept a professional distance. That one he'd need to be less close to when the moment came. The moment wasn't now. They were still too visible, too exposed, Lily still too far from cover. He needed the corridor. The corridor meant walls, angles, choke points. Geometry that worked in favor of one person who knew exactly where they were going over 2 people who were following him. Turn left here, Victor said as they reached the back hall. Ronan turned left. They were in the service corridor now, the sound of the ballroom dropping away behind them. The overhead lighting was fluorescent and utilitarian, a different world from the chandelier and the gold, concrete block walls, painted gray, the faint smell of industrial cleaner. He'd walked this hall 100 times. He knew its measurements the way he knew the square footage of his apartment. The maintenance access is about 60 feet ahead on the right, Ronan said. There's a keypad. We have the code, Victor said. Then you didn't need me, Ronan said. We needed someone to confirm the layout on the other side. There are 3 possible routes from the utility room, and I want to know which one exits where. Ronan kept walking. He was measuring the distance behind him, the distance to the door ahead. He was watching the shadow of the man on his right in the reflection on the metallic junction box bolted to the wall at the 30-foot mark. He thought about Lily in the corridor behind him, in her green dress and her good shoes, with her mother's sharp eyes and her father's stubbornness. And he thought about the fact that in approximately 15 seconds, they were going to reach a door and the geometry was going to change. He thought about all the things he'd buried in the 8 years since he'd come home. All the careful work of becoming someone whose hands fix things instead of breaking them. And he thought about how it felt to realize that what you buried doesn't disappear. It just waits. Mr. Hale, Victor said from behind him. A warning note. You're slowing down. Thinking, Ronan said. Don't think, walk. Ronan walked. The door was 10 feet away. The shadow on the junction box shifted as the man on his right adjusted his angle. 8 feet. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, and let everything that wasn't necessary go quiet. 5 feet. Victor said something. Ronan didn't catch it because he'd already stopped listening to Victor. 3 feet. The thing that had been waiting in the compartment for 8 years came to the surface, and it didn't look like rage, and it didn't look like violence. It just looked like readiness. The particular stillness before a thing begins. Ronan put his hand on the door. And then he moved. It happened fast, and it didn't happen cleanly, and anyone who later described it as fluid or effortless wasn't in that corridor. Ronan's hand was on the door handle, and he used it. Not to open the door forward, but to pull it back hard and sideways, into the man on his right, the one with the high-shouldered rifle. The edge of the metal door caught the man across the forearm, and the rifle swung wide on its sling, and in the same motion, Ronan stepped inside the swing and got his hands on the man's collar and the back of his belt and drove him into the wall. The impact was loud. The man's head connected with the concrete block, and he went down. 0.2 of a second. It hadn't been clean. Ronan's left shoulder hit the door frame during the move, and the burst of pain was sharp and immediate, and he filed it away for later the same way he filed everything. Acknowledge it. Don't spend time on it. Keep going. The second man, the careful one, had already brought his rifle up, and Ronan was already moving, using the doorframe as partial cover, angling to keep the downed man's body between himself and the line of fire. There wasn't space for a clean shot, and the careful man knew it, which was why he didn't take it, which bought Ronan 2 steps. 2 steps was enough. He covered the distance at an angle, inside the rifle's effective reach, and the careful man tried to use the weapon as a bludgeon when he understood it wasn't going to fire in time. Ronan caught the stock on his forearm. That was going to leave a mark, and answered with an elbow strike to the man's chin that wasn't elegant but was very final. The corridor was quiet. The whole thing had taken maybe 7 seconds. Ronan stood with his back to the wall, breathing through his mouth, his left shoulder on fire, and his forearm already starting to swell where the rifle stock had connected. He looked at his hands for a half-second the way he always did after a private inventory, something his first instructor had called the damage receipt. Then he looked up. Lily was standing 8 feet back down the corridor, completely still, her arms at her sides. She was watching him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before and hoped he wouldn't have to see again. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated than fear. A kind of recalibration, the look of a person who has just learned something they didn't know they were about to learn. "Come here," he said. She came immediately. He pulled her close with his good arm and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You okay?" he asked. He felt her nod. "Don't look at them," he said. Another nod. He held her for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was what he could afford, and then he straightened and looked back down the corridor in the direction they'd come from. Victor Kane had not followed them in. That was interesting. Tess. Victor had stopped at the corridor entrance. Ronan could see him at the far end, 25 feet back, standing with 2 of his remaining men, his posture unchanged, his expression as settled as it had been in the ballroom. He hadn't rushed when he heard the impact. He hadn't shouted. He'd just stopped and stood, and now he was looking down the corridor at Ronan the way a man looks at a weather system he'd predicted but hoped wouldn't arrive. "I thought you might do something like that," Victor said. His voice carried well in the concrete space. No echo worth mentioning, just the flat, clear sound of someone who didn't need to raise his voice. "Then you should have stayed closer," Ronan said. "Close is where mistakes happen." Victor glanced at his 2 men on the floor with the brief, neutral assessment of a man doing inventory. Those were good people. "They're alive," Ronan said. "You can have them back when this is over." Victor looked at him. Something moved through his eyes. Not anger, not exactly, but a cooling, the kind that happened when a person shifted from one operating mode to another. The conversational register was going away. What was replacing it was older and quieter. "You were a SEAL," Victor said. It wasn't a question. Ronan said nothing. "There's a particular way men from that program carry themselves. I've worked with some and against some, and I know the look." Victor's tone was informational, almost academic. "How long were you in?" "Long enough," Ronan said. "And now you're framing houses." "And now I'm framing houses." Victor was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor behind him, faint and muffled, Ronan could hear movement from the ballroom. Restless sounds. The ambient noise of 500 people waiting for something to resolve. 3 of Victor's men were still in there. One of them would be aware by now that something had gone wrong in the corridor. The timeline Victor had been running was fracturing. "Here's where we are," Victor said. "You've taken 2 of my people out. I have 3 left. I still have 500 guests, and I still have what I came for." He meant Victoria. He didn't say her name, but the geometry of the statement was clear. "You can't get back into that ballroom without going through me or one of my exits, and you don't know which ones I'm covering." "I have a decent guess," Ronan said. "Maybe. But you have a child with you." Victor said it without heat, without threat. Just the flat acknowledgement of a fact that changed the math. "Whatever you did in the field, you're not the same person you were then. You've got something to lose now. That slows you down." Ronan was quiet. Because that was true, and Victor knew it was true, and pretending otherwise was a waste of both their time. "Let her go," Ronan said. "She walks out the East Wing emergency exit, and you and I have a different conversation." "I'm not stopping her from walking out," Victor said. "I never wanted her." "Then call off the man you've got watching that exit." The pause that followed was very brief, barely a pause at all, just a fraction of a second, but Ronan had been watching Victor's face carefully, and he saw it. The micro-adjustment of a man deciding how much to reveal. "The East exit is clear," Victor said. "You're going to tell me that." "I just did." "I don't believe you." Another pause. And then Victor did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small radio. He held it up so Ronan could see it, then keyed it. 16. This is primary. Stand down from East Wing access. Let anyone through who isn't Hale. Static. Then a voice, brief and compliant. Copy. Victor lowered the radio. Believable enough? Ronan looked at him. He was trying to read the angle. There was always an angle, but the logic was sound enough that he couldn't immediately find the hole in it. Victor's leverage was never Lily. Victor's leverage was Victoria. Letting Lily go cost him nothing. He looked down at Lily. Her face was tilted up to his, waiting. "I need you to do something hard," he said. "Okay," she said. She didn't ask what first. Just okay, in the voice she used when she was scared, but had decided to be bigger than the scared. "You're going to walk back the way we came, but instead of going into the ballroom, you're going to take the left branch at the junction. It'll take you to the East emergency exit. It's marked. You push the bar and the alarm goes off, and that's fine. I want the alarm to go off. You go out and you stay right outside the door, and you tell anyone in a uniform that your name is Lily Hale and your dad is inside. Can you do that?" "By myself?" "By yourself." She swallowed. He watched her throat move. "What if someone stops me?" "Tell them your dad sent you. Tell them Ronan Hale, East Wing renovation crew. They'll know the name." She was quiet for a second. Then, "Are you going to be okay?" He looked at his daughter, and he chose not to answer that question the easy way because she was 9 years old and she already knew the difference between the answer he meant and the answer he gave to make her feel better, and she deserved the one he meant. "I'm working on it," he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and wasn't quite, and she squeezed his hand with both of hers, very tight, for just a moment. Then she turned and walked down the corridor away from him, her silver buttons catching the fluorescent light, her footsteps small and deliberate and getting quieter, and Ronan stood and listened until he couldn't hear them anymore. He turned back to Victor. "Now," he said. What followed in the next 4 minutes was not the kind of thing Ronan was proud of, exactly, but he wasn't ashamed of it either. It existed in the category of things that were necessary, things he'd been built for at considerable expense by people who understood that the world had dark hallways in it and someone had to be willing to go into them. He moved back into the ballroom through the stage side door, which he'd identified in Part 1 as a fire access, and which Victor had not fully secured because Victor had been running his timeline tight and the stage side door was low probability, tucked behind the left speaker rig where nobody would naturally drift during a gala. Victor's man near the stage saw him a half-second too late. The second exchange was faster than the corridor. Less space, more noise, and the crowd's response was immediate and chaotic, people lurching in several directions at once, which Ronan moved with rather than against. The second of Victor's men in the ballroom was crossing from the right side when Ronan was already past the first, and the angle was bad, crowded with bodies, and the man made the decision not to fire. Good decision. Also the decision Ronan had been counting on. He got to the man before he could reset. The takedown involved a table, 2 broken glasses, and a significant amount of noise. When it was over, Ronan was on one knee with his shoulder screaming and a long cut across his right palm from the broken glass, and Victor's man was not getting up for a while. 3 down. He stood and looked across the ballroom. The crowd had pushed to the far walls. The space between Ronan and the main entrance was largely clear, which meant the remaining 2 of Victor's men were visible, one near the main door, one near the center aisle, and both of them were now looking at Ronan with the particular stillness of men reassessing their situation. Behind him, the stage side door opened. Victor Kane walked into the ballroom. He walked in the unhurried way he'd done everything else tonight, and he was alone, and he stood in the space between Ronan and the stage, and the room understood that this was the center of something. Victor looked at the two men he had left, then back at Ronan. He made a brief gesture, flat hand pressing down, and both men held their positions, staying back, waiting. Victor reached into his jacket. Ronan's body tensed and his hands came up slightly, but what Victor produced was not a weapon. It was a phone. He looked at the screen, then at Ronan. "She made it out," he said. "The alarm went off 38 seconds ago." Ronan absorbed this. "You let her go," he said. "I told you I would." "People tell me things," Ronan said. "Not everyone means them." Victor pocketed the phone. He looked tired, suddenly, not physically, but in the specific way of someone who has been running a system and has watched it fail and is now doing the math on what comes next. "You've put me in a difficult position." "I'm not particularly worried about your position," Ronan said. "3 of my people are alive," Ronan said again. "That was a choice I made. Every time." Something shifted in Victor's expression at that. Not softening. He wasn't a man who softened, more like recognition. The slight adjustment of someone who has encountered something they didn't anticipate and is now cataloging it. "Why?" Victor asked. "Why what?" "You could have killed the first man in the corridor. That would have been faster and cleaner. You didn't." Victor looked at him steadily. "In my experience, men from your background in a situation like this don't always make that choice." Ronan looked at him. "I've got a kid," he said. "I don't want to explain to her why I killed someone at a charity gala." The honesty of that seemed to catch Victor slightly off guard. He was quiet for a moment. "Stand down," Victor said then, and it took Ronan a second to realize he was talking to his 2 remaining men. Both of them shifted, and one of them lowered his weapon with the look of someone who was genuinely relieved to be given the option. The room did not react immediately. 500 people needed a moment to understand what was happening. Then the understanding moved through the crowd like a wave, slow at first, then fast, and then the noise that had been sealed inside the room for 39 minutes came out all at once, crying, gasping, a few people beginning to move toward the doors before they'd fully processed that it was over. Victor stood in the middle of it and looked at Ronan. "You know I'll be in custody inside of 20 minutes, he said. "That's about right," Ronan said. "And you know this isn't finished. The people who hired me aren't going to stop because one night went wrong." "I know." Victor looked at him with something that Ronan could only have described as a complicated form of respect, the kind that contained more regret than admiration. "You should have stayed out of the field." "I did stay out of the field," Ronan said. "I came to a party." Victor almost laughed. It was a short sound, not quite genuine, but not entirely performed either. "Take care of your daughter, Mr. Hale." "That's the plan," Ronan said. Bam. Security arrived 4 minutes later, then police at 6 minutes, then what appeared to be a federal presence at 12. Men in plain clothes with the specific clipped efficiency of people who had been watching the building and waiting for a moment to move. Victor and his 2 standing men were taken into custody without incident. The 3 in the corridor and by the stage were helped out by paramedics. Ronan sat on the steps of the ballroom's side exit with his back against the door and his right hand wrapped in a napkin he'd grabbed off a table on the way out. The cut wasn't deep enough to need stitches probably, but it was bleeding more than he'd like, and he held pressure on it and looked at the parking lot and waited. The exit alarm was still beeping somewhere above him, thin and persistent. He heard her before he saw her. The specific quick footsteps that he'd memorized years ago without deciding to, the way you memorize the sound of anything that matters. Lily came around the corner of the building with a police officer 4 steps behind her, moving fast, and she stopped when she saw him and said, "Dad," in a voice that had a crack in the middle of it. And then she was on him, arms around his neck, and he held her with his good hand and his bad one both, the napkin falling away. And he didn't say anything for a moment because there wasn't anything he could say that wouldn't be smaller than what was happening. "I heard the alarm stop," she said into his shoulder. "Yeah, it's done." "Are you hurt?" "Hand. It's fine." She pulled back enough to look at it. Her face did the thing it did when she was deciding whether to cry or be angry, and she seemed to settle on a narrow path between them. "You're bleeding." "I know. That needs more than a napkin." "I know that too." She looked at his face for a moment with her mother's eyes, searching for the thing he wasn't saying. She'd always done this, looked for the version of him that was underneath the version he was presenting, the one that was tired or scared or unsure, because she'd learned early that he hid those things, and she'd decided somewhere along the way that she wasn't going to let him hide them all the way. "Are you okay?" she asked, the same question she'd asked in the corridor. He looked at his daughter, the green dress with the silver buttons, the mascara she'd borrowed from the teacher down the hall and applied with the unsteady hand of someone who didn't do it often, the line of her jaw that was starting to look less like a child's and more like a person's, which was a thing he noticed sometimes and didn't always know how to feel about. "Getting there," he said, and this time he meant it. She leaned back against him, and he kept his arm around her, and they stayed like that while the parking lot filled with vehicles and radio chatter and the controlled noise of an emergency resolving itself. Victoria Sterling found him there 20 minutes later. She came out the same side exit, escorted by a woman in a dark suit who peeled off when Victoria indicated with a look that she was fine. And she stood in front of Ronan and Lily, and she didn't say anything right away. She'd lost something in the last 40 minutes. Some of the careful arrangement that she'd worn into the gala had come loose. Her hair was partly down. There was a small tear at the hem of her dress from where she'd moved fast at some point. She looked, Ronan thought, significantly more like a person than she had when he'd first noticed her across the ballroom. "You're the man who fixed the chandelier," Lily said. She was looking at Victoria with direct curiosity, the kind that made adults either charmed or uncomfortable. "I didn't fix it," Victoria said. "We funded the renovation." "My dad fixed it," Lily said. "He was on the crew." Victoria looked at Ronan. "Yes," she said. "I heard. A beat." "Thank you," Victoria said. It came out plainly, without the performative weight that thank yous sometimes had when important people said them. Just the words, carrying what they meant. "You tried to trade yourself for me," Ronan said, "earlier, when you stood up and offered to go with him." "That was logic," she said. "You were the uninvolved party." "Didn't know that." "I did." She paused. "He didn't take the trade." "No." She looked at his hand, which Lily had re-wrapped with a considerably more competent napkin technique than the first attempt. "You need a hospital." "Urgent care," Ronan said. "Hospital's overkill." "He always says that," Lily said. "Last year he broke 2 ribs and went to urgent care." "I didn't know they were broken at the time," Ronan said. "You knew something was wrong with them." Something is always wrong with something. Victoria was watching this exchange with an expression Ronan couldn't quite read. Not quite amusement, and not quite something else. Something quieter that he didn't have a name for yet. "Who are you?" she asked him. Not rhetorically, like she actually wanted to know. "Ronan Hale," he said. "I frame houses." "That's not what I mean." "I know." He looked at the parking lot. A news van had pulled up at the far end, which meant a story was forming, which meant the next several hours were going to be things he didn't look forward to. "I used to be someone else. I'm not anymore." "Tonight you were." He didn't answer that because he didn't have an answer he was comfortable with yet. The part of himself that had come back tonight, the patient, precise, terrifying thing that lived in the compartment, was already retreating, settling back down into the place he kept it. He could feel it going. He always could. He didn't know how he felt about being glad it was there and simultaneously being glad it was going. "They're going to want a statement," Victoria said, nodding toward the building, meaning the law enforcement presence gathering inside. "From both of us. This is going to be complicated." "Yeah," Ronan said. "Victor Kane has connections. The people who hired him—" She stopped. "We should talk. Not tonight, but soon." "All right," Ronan said. She looked at him for a moment like she was going to say something else, then decided against it. She took a card from somewhere in her dress, he didn't ask where, and held it out. He took it with his good hand. "Tomorrow," she said, "or whenever the urgent care is finished." She went back inside. Lily watched her go, then looked at the card in Ronan's hand. Who is she? Her name's Victoria Sterling, Ronan said. Is she important? He looked at the card. Clean design, minimal text, the kind of card that assumed you already knew who you were giving it to. I think so, he said. Lily considered this. She seemed tired, she said. Yeah. Like you sometimes. He looked at his daughter. Like me sometimes, he agreed. A detective appeared in the doorway behind them and cleared his throat with the practiced patience of someone used to waiting for witnesses to finish their side conversations. Ronan got to his feet, which took slightly more effort than it should have. His shoulder had stiffened in the cool air, and his forearm was a solid band of hurt from wrist to elbow. He held out his good hand to Lily. She took it. They went back inside. Cat. The statement took 90 minutes. Ronan sat across from two detectives and a federal agent in a small room that had been someone's event planning office until about 2 hours ago and answered questions with the careful economy he'd learned years ago. Not evasive, but precise. He said what had happened in the order it happened. He confirmed his background when they asked, which they did about 12 minutes in when the records check came back, and the federal agent got very still in the way that people do when information arrives that recontextualizes everything before it. You were special operations, the federal agent said. Past tense, Ronan said. 8 years active service, 2 combat deployments. Then you... The man looked at his tablet. Separated and became a construction worker. Contractor, Ronan said. There's a difference. Right. The agent looked at him with the particular expression of a government professional encountering something that doesn't fit his category system and is deciding how to handle that. Mr. Hale, what you did tonight, I kept my daughter safe, Ronan said, and nobody got killed. That's the whole story. The agent looked at him for a long moment. That's the whole story, he repeated in the tone of someone writing it down. Yeah, Ronan said. Lily was in the next room with the victim's advocate who had given her hot chocolate and, from the sounds of it, was getting a thorough education on the structural engineering of hotel chandeliers. Ronan signed what needed signing and shook the hands that needed shaking and walked out of the event planning office at 20 minutes past midnight. His shoulder hurt. His hand hurt. His forearm hurt in a way that suggested he should probably get it x-rayed along with the hand, which meant urgent care was going to be a longer visit than he'd told Lily. He stood in the hallway and thought about the version of himself that had moved through that corridor tonight. The one he kept in the compartment, the one he'd told himself for 8 years was the past. He didn't feel good about it the way he'd once felt good about it. That was different. There was no clean satisfaction in it anymore. No sense of rightness that came from being exactly what you were trained to be. There was just effectiveness. The quiet, grim utility of having been capable of the thing the situation required. And underneath that, something else. Something he'd examine later, maybe. Or maybe he wouldn't. The door to the next room opened, and Lily appeared, holding a paper cup of hot chocolate with both hands, her hair coming loose from the careful braid she'd worn into the evening. Ready? She asked. Yeah, he said. The lady in there said I was very brave, Lily said, with the specific tone she used for compliments she wasn't sure she believed, but was considering. She's right, Ronan said. Lily thought about this. I just did what you said. That's usually what brave looks like, Ronan said. She walked beside him down the corridor toward the main exit, sipping the hot chocolate, and Ronan kept his good hand close to her without quite holding it because she was 9, and sometimes 9 meant you needed the option of your own hands. The Blackwood Grand Hotel's front doors opened onto Meridian Avenue at 23 minutes past midnight, and the air outside was cool and smelled like recent rain, and Ronan Hale stood on the top step and looked at the street and breathed it in. Behind him, the chandelier was still on. The urgent care clinic on Delancey Street was open until 2 in the morning, which Ronan knew because he'd been there before, twice for Lily, once for a job site injury involving a nail gun that he still didn't like thinking about. The woman at the front desk recognized him, or recognized the type of him, and got him processed without much ceremony. The x-ray confirmed 2 things. The forearm wasn't broken, which was good, and the hand laceration needed 4 stitches, which was less good but manageable. The shoulder was badly bruised and would feel worse before it felt better. The attending physician, a compact Korean-American woman in her 40s, who had the efficient manner of someone who worked nights by choice and didn't need to explain herself, cleaned the cut with the practiced speed of someone who had seen worse before the shift was half done. "What happened?" she asked, not like she was expecting a full answer. "Glass," Ronan said. She looked at the pattern of the cut, then at the bruising on his forearm. "The glass hit you in the forearm too?" "Different thing." "Right," she said, and didn't ask again. Lily had fallen asleep in the waiting room chair with her head on her arms and her paper cup of hot chocolate tipped over beside her, empty. The front desk woman had put a blanket over her from the cabinet behind the desk without being asked, and Ronan noticed that when he came back out and stood looking at his daughter for a moment before he picked her up, people were sometimes quietly decent. He tried to remember that on the days it was hard to believe. He carried Lily to the car with his good arm, which required some awkward geometry, and she woke up halfway through and said, "I can walk," in the fuzzy, unconvinced voice of someone still mostly asleep, and he said, "I know," and she let him carry her anyway. The story broke by 6 in the morning. Ronan knew it would. 500 guests with phones, a federal response, Victor Kane's name attached to a network of corporate espionage that the FBI had apparently been building a file on for 2 years. That kind of thing didn't stay contained. He'd expected it. He just hadn't fully modeled what it would feel like to wake up at 7:15 to 17 missed calls and his face on 3 different news sites, under headlines that ranged from hero father stops gala hostage nightmare to the considerably less accurate ex-Navy SEAL single-handedly defeats armed terror cell. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his bandaged hand and read the headlines with the particular feeling of someone watching a problem assemble itself in real time. His former unit wasn't named. His service record wasn't detailed. The stories had his name, his approximate background, his employer, and enough eyewitness accounts from the ballroom to construct a reasonably accurate timeline of events. One account, from a man he didn't recognize, described him as completely calm, like he was somewhere else entirely, like none of it was real to him. He'd read that twice and hadn't decided what he thought about it. His phone buzzed. Delgado from Barton and Associates, Ronan, saw the news. "Are you okay? Is Lily okay? Call me when you can." Then his sister from Phoenix, who he talked to maybe 4 times a year. What the hell? Then a number he didn't recognize with a 212 area code. He stared at that one for a moment, then let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from a woman named Priya, who identified herself as Victoria Sterling's executive assistant, and who said in a voice of professional warmth that Ms. Sterling would like to arrange a meeting at his convenience, and that the car service was available at any time he found suitable, and that she hoped he and his daughter were recovering well. Ronan set the phone face down on the table and drank his coffee. Lily appeared at 7:45 in her pajamas with her hair loose, stood in the kitchen doorway, and looked at him with the assessing morning look she'd had since she was 4. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." "Your hand hurt?" "Some." She went to the refrigerator and got the orange juice and poured herself a glass and then stood at the counter drinking it, looking at the phone face down on the table. "Is that the news?" "Yeah." "Are we on it?" "I am. You're a 9-year-old girl in most of them." She seemed to find this acceptable. "What are they saying?" He considered how to answer that. "That something happened and I was involved." "Are they saying nice things?" "Mostly." She nodded, finished the juice, and put the glass in the sink. Then she came and sat across from him at the table and looked at him with the directness that he'd always found slightly unnerving in a child and increasingly simply admired in the person she was becoming. "Are you okay with it?" she asked. "The attention." "No," he said. "What are you going to do?" "Try to stay out of it as much as I can," he said. "Let it pass." She looked at him steadily. "And the woman, Victoria. She wants to meet. Are you going to?" He picked up his coffee cup, put it down. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Lily nodded like she'd expected that answer or like she'd already made her own assessment and was confirming it. She got up, kissed the top of his head. a thing she'd started doing recently that he didn't comment on because commenting on it might make her stop, and went back to her room to get ready for school. Ronan sat alone in the kitchen with the phone and the coffee and the morning light coming in at a low angle through the window over the sink, and he thought about what Victor had said in the corridor. "You've got something to lose now. That slows you down." He thought about whether that was true, and whether true meant bad, and he didn't reach a conclusion about it before Lily reappeared asking where her blue sneakers were, and the morning moved on the way mornings did, regardless of what had happened the night before. He called Victoria's number at 9:30 after the school drop-off. She answered herself, which he hadn't expected. No assistant routing, no hold music, just Victoria Sterling's voice, slightly different on the phone than in person. Less measured somehow, or maybe just differently arranged without the visual context around it. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Ronan's fine," he said. "How are you doing?" A brief pause, like the question had arrived slightly sideways. "I'm functional," she said. "You?" Hands stitched, shoulders sore. "Yeah, functional's right." "I have some things I need to tell you," she said. Things that didn't make it into the statement last night because I wasn't sure who was in the room, about what Victor Kane was actually after, and why. "The corporate angle," Ronan said. "More than corporate," she said. "Can you come to the office, or if you'd prefer somewhere else?" "Office is fine," he said. He'd looked her up that morning in the window between Lily leaving for school and the phone call. Victoria Sterling, founder and CEO of Nexus Systems, a technology firm specializing in secure communications infrastructure, the kind of systems that governments and financial institutions use to run things they didn't want intercepted. She'd founded it at 24 with two partners who were no longer partners, had scaled it to $1 billion valuation in 6 years, and had in the past 18 months expanded into a contract with a federal agency that multiple news pieces described carefully and vaguely as sensitive national infrastructure work. She was 30 years old. She had a graduate degree in systems engineering from MIT and an undergraduate degree in applied mathematics from a school in New England that she'd attended on a full scholarship. She gave to pediatric oncology research, which was why she'd been at the gala. There were photos of her at industry events and award ceremonies and 2 congressional hearings, and in all of them she looked exactly as she'd looked in the ballroom, composed, alert, slightly separate from whatever was happening around her. There was one photo he'd paused on. It was from a conference 3 years ago, and someone had caught her between events, not posed, standing in a corridor with a coffee cup and a folder, reading something. Her face was fully unguarded in it in the way faces sometimes went when people didn't know a camera was there, not smiling, not performing, just thinking with an expression that was tired and focused and very human. He'd recognized the look. He'd seen it in his own mirror enough times to know what it meant. It meant you were the person responsible for the thing, and the thing was very large, and some days the size of it was more visible than others. Nexus Systems occupied floors 14 through 19 of a building on West 47th that had the specific glass and steel restraint of architecture that was trying to look serious rather than impressive. The lobby had good security. He clocked the layers automatically, couldn't help it. And the reception desk directed him to the 19th floor, where Preya, who matched her phone voice, walked him through a hallway of deliberately unadorned walls and into a corner office that looked out over the city to the north and west. Victoria was standing at the window when he came in, not in the performed way people stood at windows in movies, just actually standing there, looking out, with a coffee cup in her hand and the particular quality of stillness that meant she'd been doing that for a while. She turned when she heard him. She looked different in daylight, in her own space. The gala version of her had been armored in a specific way. The dress, the hair, the careful professional warmth. Here she was in a dark blazer and gray trousers and her hair down, and she looked, Ronan thought, more like the woman in the conference photo. Plausible. Present. "Sit down," she said, then stopped. "You don't have to sit if you don't want to." "I'll sit," he said. She sat across from him at a table along the wall rather than behind the desk, which he noticed. A choice. She'd thought about where to have this conversation. "How's your hand?" she asked. 4 stitches. It's fine." "And your daughter?" "She went to school," he said. She was annoyed that it was a normal Thursday, something almost like a smile. She's remarkable. She is, Ronan said, without the deflection he usually used when people said things like that. He was tired enough this morning to just agree. Victoria set down her coffee cup and looked at her hands for a moment, organizing something. I need to give you context that I couldn't give the federal agents last night, because at least 2 of them have connections to a man named Gerald Ashworth, and Ashworth is part of the problem. Ronan looked at her. Victor Kane was hired, she said, not by criminals, by a board faction within a company called Harlan Group, which has been attempting to acquire Nexus for 14 months. We've refused the acquisition 3 times. The federal contract I'm currently executing, the infrastructure work, is the asset they actually want, not my company, the contract, and the technical architecture behind it. What's the contract? She looked at him steadily. Secure communication backbone for 17 federal agencies. It processes, routes, and encrypts approximately 40% of classified domestic communications infrastructure. Ronan was quiet for a moment. So whoever controls Nexus controls the pipeline. Effectively, she said, they can't acquire it through the board because I hold controlling interest. They can't acquire it through the federal contract because I'm the named party. So the next option is, she paused, apply pressure. Victor was supposed to take me from the gala and hold me in a location while Harlan Group's people made certain moves with the contract documentation. Force my hand on the acquisition or compromise my position as the named contractor. By making it look like you weren't capable of protecting the contract's security, Ronan said. A CEO who gets taken hostage from a public event is a liability to a federal security contract, she said flatly. Yes, Ronan looked at the window. The city was its usual indifferent self out there, going about its Thursday without reference to any of this. Victor told me last night that it wasn't finished, he said. It isn't, she said. Arresting Victor removes one layer. Harlan Group's board faction is still intact, the acquisition pressure is still active, and I have reason to believe there are 2 people inside my company who've been providing operational information to Ashworth's team. Inside your company, Ronan said. Yes. He looked at her. Why are you telling me this? She met his eyes. Because last night you made decisions under pressure that most people I pay significantly more to advise me couldn't make. Because you assessed a complicated situation accurately, under considerable physical threat, while managing your first priority. She paused. And because Victor Kane, who's been doing this kind of work for 15 years, thought you were worth choosing as the leverage point in the room. That's not nothing. He chose me because I looked ordinary, Ronan said. He chose you because something told him you weren't, she said. Those are different things. Ronan sat with that for a moment. I'm a contractor, he said. I know what you are. I frame houses, he said. I do school pickups. I make bread on Sundays because Lily likes the smell when she wakes up. That's what I am now. The other thing was a long time ago. It was 3 days ago, Victoria said. Not unkindly, just precisely. He didn't have an answer for that, because it was true, and the truth of it was something he was still sitting in, turning over, trying to find the edges of. I'm not asking you to go back to what you were, she said. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who understood that the next few sentences mattered and had thought about how to say them. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consult. Help me understand the security gaps. Look at what we have and tell me what you'd do if you were trying to get around it. She paused. I have people who know technology. I don't have anyone who knows how a room full of armed men thinks. Ronan looked at the table. There was a scratch on the surface near his bandaged hand, a thin line in the wood, the kind that happened when something sharp had been moved carelessly across it once, probably years ago. What happened to the people inside your company? He said. The 2 you think have been feeding information. I don't know yet. I need to confirm it before I move. If I help you with the security assessment and you confirm them, what happens to them? She frowned slightly. Legal process? Federal, probably, given the contract. Not something quieter. She looked at him with an expression of genuine offense that seemed real rather than performed. I'm not in that business. Some people who run contracts like yours are. I'm not, she said. I want them out of my company and in front of a federal prosecutor. I want Ashworth's board faction investigated. I want the acquisition attempt stopped through legal means. She held his eyes. That's all. He believed her. He wasn't sure why exactly. He'd been wrong about people before, the kind of wrong that cost things he couldn't get back. But something in the consistency of her manner, the way she'd been the same person in the ballroom and in the corridor and now in this office, made him believe her. My rate is $65 an hour, he said. That's what I charge for specialist consultation on the construction side. I don't know what the right number is for this. She named a number. He kept his face still, but internally, something rearranged slightly. That was significantly more than $65 an hour. That's for a 30-day assessment, she said. If it runs longer, we renegotiate. I need to be home by 3:15 most days, he said. School pickup. She didn't blink. That's not a problem. And I'm not... He stopped, choosing the words carefully. I'm not going back into the field. Whatever the assessment finds, the response isn't me. Understood. I mean that. I believe you, she said. He looked at his bandaged hand resting on the table. 4 stitches and a bruised forearm and a shoulder that was going to make sleeping difficult for the next week, and a daughter who'd fallen asleep in a waiting room chair and let him carry her to the car because she was 9 and it had been a long night. He thought about what Victor had said. You've got something to lose now. And he thought about the way that was framed as a weakness and how he wasn't sure he agreed. All right, he said. Victoria nodded once, with the efficiency of someone who doesn't make more of a yes than the yes requires. I'll have Priya send over the ND as today, she said. And I'd like to introduce you to my head of security. His name is Brent Calloway, former Secret Service Good Instincts. So you two can start building a picture of what we're working with. Fine, Ronan said. One more thing, Victoria said, and something in her tone changed just slightly. The professional register dropping a fraction, something less managed coming through the gap. Last night, when you went into the corridor with Kane, you didn't know how many men he had left in the ballroom or what they'd do while you were gone. No, Ronan said. That was a significant risk. Yes. You took it anyway. He looked at her. He had my daughter. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he didn't expect. My mother died when I was 11. There wasn't anyone who... She stopped, started again differently. I didn't have someone who would take that kind of risk for me when I was that age. She said it in the specific tone of someone reporting a fact rather than asking for a response. Just setting something down on the table between them, not asking him to pick it up. He didn't pick it up, but he heard it. I'm sorry, he said, because it was true and it was enough. She nodded once, back to the measured self. 3 o'clock pickup, she said. I'll make sure it's in Priya's calendar. Bam. He was in the elevator on the way down when his phone buzzed. A text from Lily's teacher, a round-faced, enthusiastic woman named Ms. Okafor, who sent approximately 4 texts per day and meant every one of them. Lily shared what happened at the hotel last night during morning circle. She was very matter-of-fact about it. She said, and I'm quoting, "My dad handled it. I just wanted you to know she seems okay. She's currently explaining load-bearing column mechanics to the class. I have no idea how this happened, but they're all very into it." Ronan read the text twice and then stood in the lobby of Victoria Sterling's building and did something he hadn't done in approximately 48 hours, which was laugh. A short, genuine thing, surprised out of him. The security guard at the front desk looked over. Sorry, Ronan said. Long night? The guard asked, with the particular sympathy of someone who worked nights and understood. Long couple of days, Ronan said. He pushed through the revolving door and out onto West 47th, where the city was exactly as indifferent as it had been from the 19th floor, and the air smelled like exhaust and someone's cart coffee and the particular non-smell of a November morning in a city that was mostly concrete. He walked to where he'd parked. The investigation into Victor Kane's network would take, as it turned out, the better part of 4 months. Ronan would learn that from Calloway, who was exactly what Victoria had described: solid instincts, methodical, a former agent's habit of trusting process over intuition that complemented rather than conflicted with the way Ronan's mind worked. The two men would not become friends exactly, but they would become the kind of professional allies who understood each other's angles, which was sometimes more useful. The two internal sources Victoria had suspected were confirmed in the third week. One was a director of technical operations who had been passing architecture documentation to Ashworth's team for 7 months. The other was a junior analyst who had been recruited through a personal financial vulnerability: debt, a sick parent, the oldest leverage in the world. Ronan had flagged the second one with more precision than Calloway expected, based on a pattern of access log behavior that reminded him of something he'd seen once before in a context he didn't explain. The director went to a federal prosecutor. The analyst, whose name was Marcus Webb, and who was 26 years old and clearly terrified when it became clear the game was over, cooperated fully and was handled with what Ronan privately felt was more compassion than the situation required, and also more than Marcus probably deserved, and also exactly the right amount. Victoria had made that call. He hadn't argued with it. The Harlan Group's board faction became the subject of a federal investigation that would take considerably longer and produce considerably less satisfying results, in the way that investigations into powerful people with good lawyers usually did. Gerald Ashworth, specifically, would remain several layers removed from provable culpability for another 14 months, which was a fact that Ronan accepted because the alternative was carrying around resentment about a legal process he couldn't control, and he'd learned a long time ago that that particular weight didn't distribute well. What he thought about more, in the evenings after Lily was in bed and the apartment was quiet, was the 2 months in between the start of the assessment and the moment things began to resolve. The ordinary rhythm of it, driving to Nexus in the morning, working with Calloway through access logs and personnel files and physical security schematics, picking up Lily at 3:15, making dinner, helping with homework, reading until she fell asleep, and then going back to his notes at the kitchen table until midnight. It wasn't the life he'd had before the gala. But it wasn't entirely different from it either. He was still the person who made bread on Sundays. He was still the person who knew exactly which teachers gave Lily too much homework and which ones didn't give her enough. He was still the person she came to with questions that had no clean answers, about her mother, about growing up, about what it meant to be brave in the specific way that she'd asked him about 3 days after the gala, sitting on the counter while he made breakfast. Brave like I was at the hotel? She'd asked. Or brave like a different kind? Both, he'd said. Same thing, different size. She'd thought about it. It didn't feel brave. It felt like I was just doing the next thing because there wasn't a different thing to do. That's what brave usually feels like, he'd said. She'd sat with that for a moment. Is that what it felt like for you? He'd cracked 2 eggs into the pan and thought about the corridor and the moment at the door, and the 7 seconds and the forearm, and the way the compartment had opened, and he'd thought about the version of brave that was built into him by years of training versus the version that came from something older and more fundamental and less explainable. Kind of, he said. There's a version that's training and a version that's just, this is my person and I'll do whatever is required. The second one doesn't feel like anything. It just happens. Lily had looked at him with her mother's eyes. I was scared, she said. I know. I don't want you to think I wasn't. I never thought that, he said. Being scared and doing the next thing anyway. That's the whole thing, Lily. That's all courage is. She'd nodded, slowly, filing it away, in the careful way she filed things that mattered to her. He'd flipped the eggs and not said anything else because it was enough. And she'd understood it was enough. And they'd had breakfast in the ordinary morning light of their ordinary kitchen. And outside the window, the street had been doing its usual indifferent thing. And none of that was spectacular or resolved or finished. It was just continuing. Which was, Ronan had come to understand, the most that you could really ask of any given morning. The stitches came out on a Tuesday, 11 days after the gala, in the same urgent care clinic on Delancey Street, with the same physician who'd put them in. She examined the hand with the same efficient neutrality she'd examined everything with, and said the healing was clean and to keep it dry for another 3 days, and that was that. Ronan drove home with his hand on the wheel and the radio off, and thought about how strange it was that the body just continued. Repaired itself without being asked. The shoulder was down to a manageable ache. The forearm bruising had gone through its full spectrum, yellow now at the edges, fading toward the color of skin. In another week, there'd be nothing visible left of the night at the Blackwood Grand, at least nothing that showed on the outside. The inside was a different accounting. Not trauma, exactly. He'd had enough exposure to what actual trauma did to a person to know the difference, and what he was carrying wasn't that. It was more like the residue of having been reminded of something he'd spent considerable effort partially forgetting. The compartment that he'd built over 8 years, that careful internal architecture, had been opened and examined and then closed again. But a room that's been opened is different from one that's always been shut. You know now, with certainty, what's in it. You can't quite return to the comfortable approximation of not knowing. He wasn't sure if that was bad. He'd thought about it on the drives to Nexus in the mornings, in the particular stillness of early traffic when his mind had space to move. He'd thought about what it meant to be built for something and then to choose something else, and whether the choosing undid the building, and whether the building was a thing to be ashamed of or just a thing that was true, the same way a lot of true things weren't chosen and weren't the whole story. He hadn't reached a conclusion. He suspected he wasn't going to, and that the not concluding was itself the answer. The morning Gerald Ashworth's name appeared in a federal indictment was a Wednesday in late February, 4.5 months after the gala. Ronan found out from Calloway, who sent a text at 7:48 that said simply, "It happened. Check the news." He read the coverage over breakfast while Lily ate cereal and tried to talk to him about a presentation she was giving at school on structural engineering in ancient Rome, which she'd pivoted to from chandeliers after the hotel, and which Ms. Okafor had apparently encouraged with a level of enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including Ms. Okafor. Aqueducts are basically just load management over distance, Lily was saying. It's the same principle as a suspension bridge, just horizontal. Miss Okafor didn't know that, and I think she should have. She teaches 4th grade, Ronan said without looking up from his phone. That doesn't mean she shouldn't know about aqueducts. That's fair, he said. He put the phone down. On the screen, a federal prosecutor was quoted saying the indictment covered charges including conspiracy to commit extortion, procurement fraud, and interference with a federal security contract. Ashworth's name was third on a list of 6 defendants, which meant he'd had company in this, and company meant corroboration, which meant the case was probably more solid than Ronan had let himself expect. He'd been managing his expectations about what the legal process would actually produce, because managed expectations were how you avoided the bitterness that came from wanting justice to be faster and cleaner than it was. This was faster and cleaner than he'd expected. He texted Calloway back, "Good." Then he put the phone in his pocket and asked Lily to tell him more about the aqueducts, and she did, at length, through the rest of breakfast and the drive to school, and he listened to all of it. I've restructured Calloway's team based on the assessment, but there are gaps that his background doesn't cover, and yours does. Ronan walked to the window of his apartment. Outside, the street was doing its regular Wednesday thing. A delivery truck double parked, 2 women with strollers navigating around it, a man with a dog who'd stopped to check his phone, while the dog investigated a fire hydrant with the focused dedication of a professional. He thought about what he'd told Victoria in the office that first day. I'm not going back into the field. And what she'd said in response, understood. The thing about people who meant what they said was that you could hold them to it, and the thing about holding someone to what they said was that it required trusting them enough to try. He'd been testing that trust for 4 months, quietly, the way he tested most things. Not by confronting it directly, but by watching how it behaved when no one was performing for him. She'd been consistent. That was what he kept coming back to. Not perfect. She was impatient sometimes, and occasionally moved faster on decisions than the information warranted, and had a habit of assuming that people who understood the technical dimension of a problem also understood the human dimension, which was not reliably true. But consistent. The person she'd been in the ballroom and the corridor and the 19th floor office was the same person she was at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning in the middle of a federal indictment. He trusted consistency more than he trusted nearly anything else, because consistency was the one thing you couldn't fake indefinitely. A few days a month, he said. To start. Same terms. I was thinking better terms, she said. But we can negotiate. School pickup is still non-negotiable. It's already in Priya's calendar, she said. It's been in Priya's calendar since November. He told Lily about Ashworth's indictment that evening, in the approximately age-appropriate version that involved fewer details about procurement fraud and more about the general concept of people who tried to take things that weren't theirs and the mechanisms that existed to stop them. Lily listened with the focused attention she applied to things she'd already partially figured out and was now getting confirmation on. So it's done? She asked. This part, he said. There's still a trial. But the dangerous part. The immediate dangerous part, he said, because he wasn't going to lie to her about there always being some version of the thing ongoing, some next layer, because she was too sharp to believe clean endings, and he respected that. Yes, that's done. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, which with Lily usually meant processing. Do you like working with her? She asked. Victoria. He thought about it. Yeah, he said. She's direct. She doesn't waste time. You like that. I like that, he agreed. Is she your friend? He considered the word. It was a 9-year-old's word for a thing that was probably more complicated than the word covered, but it was also not entirely wrong. Something like that, he said. It's still being figured out. Lily seemed to find this acceptable. She went back to her book. She was in a phase of reading historical fiction about ancient civilizations, which was clearly connected to the aqueduct presentation and had probably started there and would, knowing Lily, expand until it consumed most of the available reading material in the apartment. He watched her for a moment from the kitchen doorway, the lamp making a warm pool around her, her feet tucked under her on the couch. He thought about what she'd said in the car on the morning after the gala, almost to herself, looking out the window at the streets going by. It's weird. Everything looks the same, but it doesn't feel the same. And how he'd said that happens, and she'd said, does it go back to normal? And he'd said a different normal. And she'd said okay in the tone of a person deciding to be okay with something she didn't entirely understand yet. He thought about how that was the most honest thing he'd been able to give her, and how she'd taken it anyway, and how that was its own kind of brave, the ordinary, unspectacular kind that didn't get news coverage or federal indictments. The kind that was just, this is what's true, and I'm going to live in it. Spring arrived with the particular grudging quality of springs in a city that had been cold a long time. Not warm so much as less cold, the light changing its angle slightly, people on the street looking up more often. Ronan noticed it in the quality of morning. The bread he made on Sundays started to smell different, the yeast more active in the warmer kitchen air, and Lily started leaving the window over her desk cracked while she did homework, which she only did when the outside air was finally worth something. He was 3 months into the retainer arrangement with Nexus. It had settled into a rhythm that he hadn't entirely predicted, but had come to find genuinely useful to him in a way that went beyond the financial dimension. Though the financial dimension was not nothing. He'd paid off the remaining balance on the car, started a college account for Lily that had actual money in it rather than the theoretical future money he'd been promising himself for 2 years, and bought a pair of dress shoes so that if he ever ended up at another charity gala, he would not be wearing work boots, though he privately acknowledged that the work boots had handled the situation about as well as any footwear could have. The thing about the work with Nexus that he hadn't anticipated was what it did to the way he thought about the other thing. The construction, the framing, the ordinary work of physical building that had been his whole professional life for 8 years. He'd worried, somewhere under the surface, that going back into the orbit of security work would make the construction feel smaller, the way going back to a house you grew up in could make you feel how low the ceilings were. It hadn't worked that way. If anything, the contrast had done something useful, reminded him why he'd chosen the building work in the first place, what it gave him that the other thing hadn't. Construction was visible. You stood at the end of a day, and there was a thing that existed that hadn't existed before. A wall. A floor. A framework for something that someone was going to live their life inside of. There was no ambiguity about whether the work had been done. The evidence was right there, load-bearing and permanent, and it didn't require a federal indictment to confirm. He'd missed that. The months he'd been mostly in conference rooms and at screens. He was glad to be back on a site. Okay. The presentation Lily gave on Roman aqueducts was on a Thursday in March, and Ronan took the morning off from a site job to attend, which required coordinating with his crew lead in a way that involved explaining that he needed to see his daughter present to a room of fourth graders about ancient hydraulic engineering, which his crew lead, a 40-year-old man from New Jersey named Pat, who had 3 kids of his own, accepted without a single question. The school gymnasium smelled like it always smelled, the specific combination of floor polish and accumulated childhood that Ronan associated entirely with Lily's school and no other place. He sat in the second row of folding chairs among a collection of parents and siblings and grandparents, most of whom were checking their phones until Lily walked up to the small podium they'd set up at the front. She'd dressed carefully. The green dress was too formal for school, so she'd settled on dark pants and a blue sweater that he didn't recognize, which meant she'd either borrowed it or acquired it through some means he wasn't going to investigate. Her hair was braided, a little unevenly because she'd done it herself and hadn't asked for help, which was a thing she'd started doing more of recently, attempting the thing herself first, asking later only if it genuinely didn't work. She stood at the podium and looked at the audience with the focused, unsentimental attention she gave to most things, and she began. She was good at it. Ronan hadn't known that about her in quite this specific way. She'd always been articulate, always been confident in conversation, but this was different. A room of faces all pointed at her and her holding the space without fidgeting, making eye contact with different sections of the audience, the way a practiced speaker did, explaining the arch mechanics of a Roman aqueduct with the same clarity and enthusiasm she'd used on him about chandeliers and suspension bridges, and a dozen other structural things she'd absorbed in the months since the gala had, apparently, ignited something in her about how buildings worked and why they stood. Partway through, she said something that made him stop thinking about anything else. She said, "The thing about a structure is that the most important parts are usually the ones you don't see. The foundation, the load-bearing elements inside the wall, the pieces that are doing all the work while everything nice-looking is on top of them. The Romans understood that. They didn't put the heavy stone on top without making sure everything underneath could handle it first. And that's why some of their aqueducts are still standing." She moved on to the next point. He sat in his folding chair and did not move for a moment. He didn't know if she'd thought about him when she wrote that, or if she was talking about Roman engineering with the single-minded focus she brought to everything she was interested in, or if the thing that was true about Roman aqueducts was also true about other things, and she'd noticed that the way she noticed most things, quietly, without announcing it. He didn't ask her later. Some things were better held without examination. She got a very good response from the room, including a genuinely enthusiastic reaction from Miss Okafor, who had clearly been converted. On the drive home, she was in the elevated, slightly exhausted mood of a person who has put significant effort into something and had it land right. "How was it?" she asked, which was her way of asking how he thought it had gone, since she already knew how she thought it had gone. "Really good," he said. The arch part in the middle felt rushed. It didn't sound rushed from where I was. I went too fast on the keystone explanation. "Lily," he said, "it was really good." She looked out the window. "Okay," she said, with the slightly grudging tone of someone accepting a compliment they'd already mostly given themselves internally. "I think the keystone part could be better, though. You can do the keystone part better next time." "There probably won't be a next time." "There will always be a next time," he said. "You'll find something else to present about. You always do." She considered this. "Maybe bridges," she said. "Suspension versus cable stay. Most people don't know there's a difference." "Most people don't," he agreed. Victoria came to dinner in April. It had been Lily's idea, delivered to Ronan in the direct manner she'd adopted for suggestions she'd been thinking about for a while and had decided were reasonable enough to say out loud. "You should have Victoria over for dinner. You talk about her like she's a work person, but she's also a regular person, and regular people have dinner. Also, you make good food, and she probably doesn't eat enough good food because she works all the time." Ronan had looked at his daughter. "What?" Lily said. "It's logical." He'd thought about it for 2 days and then called Victoria and said, My daughter thinks you should come to dinner, in a tone that he hoped communicated both that this was Lily's idea and that he also thought it was a reasonable idea, which was true. Victoria had been quiet for a second, and then said, "I'd like that." She arrived on a Saturday in April with a bottle of sparkling water she'd brought because she hadn't known what to bring, and seemed mildly self-conscious about the choice, which was the first time he'd seen her mildly self-conscious about anything. She was wearing jeans and a dark green pullover and looked, he thought, like someone who had taken the occasion seriously in the specific way of someone who didn't often have Saturday evenings that were about nothing in particular. Lily met her at the door with the firm handshake she'd adopted recently, which she'd told Ronan made people take her more seriously, which was probably true. "I'm Lily," she said unnecessarily. "I know," Victoria said. "I'm Victoria." "I know," Lily said. "Come in. Dad's making pasta." He was making pasta, the kind with the long preparation that Lily called the complicated one, and that he only made when there was enough time to do it right. Fresh dough, slow sauce, the kind of meal that required most of an afternoon and produced a kitchen that smelled the way a kitchen was supposed to smell. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at the state of it. Flour on the counter, the sauce pot going slow on the back burner, a dish towel over his shoulder, with an expression he couldn't immediately classify. "Can I help?" she asked. "You can sit," he said. "I'd rather help." He looked at her. "Can you chop vegetables without taking it too seriously?" She considered this genuinely. "I can try," she said. He gave her an onion and a cutting board, and she did in fact take it somewhat seriously, with the focused attention she brought to most tasks, but she also talked while she did it, which was new. Not the measured, purposeful conversation of their office meetings, but something looser, following its own logic. She asked him how he'd learned to make pasta, and he told her about a rotation in Italy he wasn't supposed to talk about that had resulted, unexpectedly, in a week-long education from the grandmother of a local contact who had decided he was too thin. She asked how long the sauce needed, and he told her 3 more hours, ideally, but 2 was fine. She asked what Lily was like as a baby, and he told her Lily had been a ferociously alert baby who seemed annoyed by sleep from the first week, which had not changed. Lily drifted in and out of the kitchen with the ease of someone in her own space, offering opinions when she had them and disappearing when she didn't, and at one point she stood next to Victoria at the cutting board and watched her chop for a moment and said, with the diplomatic honesty she applied to everything, "You're holding the knife wrong. Dad, she's holding the knife wrong." "I can see that," Ronan said. Victoria looked at the knife. "Your knuckle should be against the blade as a guide," Lily said, and repositioned Victoria's hand with the unselfconscious authority of a person who knows how to do a thing and can't see any reason not to show you. "There. That's safer and faster." Victoria looked at her hand, then at Lily. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," Lily said, and left the kitchen. Victoria looked at Ronan. "She does that," he said. "She's right, though," Victoria said. "That's better." They ate at the kitchen table rather than the small dining area, because the kitchen table was where they always ate, and Ronan hadn't thought to suggest otherwise, and the pasta was good, and Lily talked about aqueducts, and then about a book she was reading, and then about a disagreement she was having with a classmate about the plot of that book, which required some context setting, but which Victoria engaged with without the slightly glazed patience that adults sometimes applied to children's conversational interests. She asked questions that were actual questions rather than the encouraging noises kind, and Lily recognized the difference immediately and responded to it, and the conversation went somewhere neither of them had planned, which was what conversations did when both people in them were genuinely paying attention. Ronan sat at his kitchen table and ate his pasta and watched this, and felt something he didn't immediately put a name to. After dinner, Lily retreated to her room with the self-possessed tact of someone who had decided the adults should have some time, and Ronan and Victoria sat with coffee at the cleared table while the city did its Saturday night thing outside the window. Somewhere a few blocks away, someone was playing music that was almost too far away to identify. "She's extraordinary," Victoria said. "Yeah," he said. "She looks at people like she's already decided to take them seriously," Victoria said. "Most adults don't do that." "Her mother was like that," he said. It came out more easily than it usually did, which surprised him slightly. Victoria looked at him. "You don't talk about her much." "No." "Is that—" She stopped, started differently. You don't have to. She died when Lily was 2, he said. Cardiac event. No warning. She was healthy, she was 30, and then she was gone. He said it in the flat way he'd learned to say it, the way that carried the information without making the other person feel responsible for having asked. Lily doesn't have a lot of memories of her. She has photographs and the things I've told her and the things her grandmother has told her. And she has the way she looks at people, which came from somewhere before I could teach it to her. Victoria was quiet. He thought about what she'd told him in the office months ago. I didn't have someone who would take that kind of risk for me when I was that age. And the flat way she'd said it, the practiced neutrality of a person who had told themselves a difficult thing so many times that the telling had stopped hurting on the surface. Your mother, he said, at 11. That's a long time to be the person responsible for yourself. She looked at him. I had a father, she said. He was present. He just wasn't good at the parts that mattered. She paused. He was better at the parts that were visible. The load-bearing parts, Ronan said. She looked at him questioningly. Something Lily said, he said, in her presentation, about how the most important parts of a structure are usually the ones you don't see. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, that's exactly it. She looked at her coffee cup. He could do the visible parts, the school fees, the appropriate holidays. He couldn't do the listening, the being present when there wasn't a specific occasion. She said it without bitterness, which was the thing that made it land harder somehow. I learned very early that being functional was the most important thing. If you're functional, you don't need the other parts. Does that still feel true? He asked. She considered it honestly. Less than it used to, she said. Being in that ballroom and having someone, not paid security, not protocol, just a person, make the decision to... She stopped. It rearranged something. I don't have a cleaner way to say that. You don't need a cleaner way, he said. They sat for a moment in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over months of working alongside each other, the kind of quiet that didn't require management or filling. I want to do something with the foundation, she said. The Nexus charitable arm. I've been giving to causes at a distance, writing checks, approving grants. What you said once, early on, that you didn't understand how I could spend that much on the right things without seeing where it went. She paused. I've been thinking about that. I didn't mean it as a criticism, he said. I know, she said. That's why I've been thinking about it. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I want to get closer to it. The Pediatric Oncology Foundation. There are families who are in crisis not just medically, but financially, logistically, the whole supporting infrastructure of a life falling apart while someone they love is sick. I want to understand what that actually looks like for a specific family, not an aggregated report. She paused. Calloway thinks I'm making too much work for myself. Calloway is very good at what he does, and this isn't what he does, Ronan said. She looked at him. You think it's the right move. I think you already know it's the right move, Sek, he said. You wouldn't have brought it up otherwise. She was quiet. Then, would you come with me? When I visit. Not in a security capacity, just, I find I make better decisions when there's someone in the room who asks the question I didn't think to ask. He thought about what that was, being that person for someone. He knew what it cost, and he knew what it gave, and he knew that the giving was larger than the cost, if the someone was worth it. Yeah, he said, I can do that. There's a thing that happens sometimes to people who have spent a long time being invisible. Not the enforced invisibility of being overlooked or dismissed, though Ronan had known that version too, the blazer and the boots at the charity gala, the man standing near the dessert table who nobody looked at twice. But the chosen invisibility, the deliberate receding into ordinary life, the careful work of becoming a person whose past is in its compartment and whose present is bread on Sundays and school pickups and a daughter who knows everything about load-bearing walls. The thing that happens is that the invisibility stops being a choice you make and starts being a shape you've grown into. And then something comes along and finds the shape, and it turns out the shape is still you, underneath. The same person who could read a room and count exits and move in the specific way that only comes from having been built very deliberately for very serious purposes. Ronan understood, in the months after the gala, that this didn't have to be a contradiction. The man who framed houses and the man in the corridor were the same man. The father who saved bread for his daughter and the seal who came back when his daughter was threatened were the same person, and the years between hadn't canceled either version. They'd just added to the total. You didn't become less of what you were by becoming something else. You became larger than either thing alone. He didn't arrive at this understanding cleanly. He arrived at it in pieces, over months, in the ordinary moments that were the actual texture of his days, cutting Lily's hair badly and having her forgive him and do the rest herself, talking on the phone with his sister from Phoenix about nothing in particular for 40 minutes on a Sunday, eating lunch alone on a construction site and watching the framework he'd built that morning hold its own weight the way it was designed to. He arrived at it partly through Lily, who had a gift for saying the thing that mattered in the middle of saying something else entirely, and partly through Victoria, who had the engineer's habit of reducing systems to their essential components, and the slowly developing human habit of understanding that essential components weren't always visible from the outside, and partly through the work itself, both the construction and the consulting, both the things that built up and the things that held the line. He arrived at it imperfectly, with loose ends and unresolved questions, and the knowledge that the Harlan Group's trial would run its slow institutional course and produce whatever it produced, and that there would be other people who wanted what Victoria had built and would try to take it through means that made them feel powerful, and that the world was not arranged in a way that guaranteed clean resolutions to complicated problems. But there was Lily, who was 10 in July and spent the weeks before her birthday designing a presentation on cable stay bridge mechanics because she'd decided that was better than a party, and Ronan had said, okay, because of course he had. And there was Victoria, who had visited 2 families through the Pediatric Foundation in the spring and come back from both visits quieter and more purposeful in the specific way of someone who has seen something real and is deciding what to do with it, and who had told him in her direct, no-preamble way that the foundation was going to restructure its grant process to include emergency logistical support as a primary category, and that he'd been right about getting closer. And there was the kitchen table where they'd eaten pasta on a Saturday in April, and the coffee that had gone cold while they talked, and Lily's door cracked slightly the way she left it when she'd gone to her room but was still listening, which Ronan had noticed and hadn't mentioned, and which he suspected Victoria had noticed too. He was still the man who'd stood near the dessert table, still the man everyone overlooked, or the man who let them overlook him, which wasn't quite the same thing but produced a similar effect. He was still the father first and everything else second, and he didn't think that was going to change, and he didn't want it to. But he was also the man who was called when something needed to be understood that other people didn't have the background to understand, and who could walk into a room full of important people and ask the question that mattered and hold the silence until someone answered it honestly, and who had learned, was still learning, would always be learning, that the most important things in any structure were the ones doing the work where nobody was looking. On the Sunday after Lily's birthday, he made bread. She was at the kitchen table behind him doing something with a ruler and a notebook that had started as bridge drawings and was now, he suspected, evolving into something else. Some new interest that would require a presentation, that would require research, that would require him to learn something he didn't know so he could follow her into it. The bread was in the oven. The apartment was warm. Outside, the street was doing its indifferent Sunday thing, and the light was the particular gold of late afternoon in summer, long and level and unhurried. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah." "What do you think is the most important invention in the history of structural engineering?" He thought about it. He was supposed to say the arch, probably, or concrete, or the steel I-beam. He was supposed to give her an answer she could use. "The level," he said. She looked up. "The level? Like the tool?" "If you can't determine what's plumb, nothing else you build on top of it matters," he said. Every sophisticated structure in history started with someone being able to say, "This is where we actually are. Not where we assumed we were. Not where we wished we were. Where we actually are." He paused. "Everything else comes after that." Lily looked at him with her mother's eyes. "That's good," she said. "I'm going to use that." "Use it," he said. She went back to her notebook. He turned back to the oven, and the bread was almost done, and the afternoon was doing what afternoons did, moving forward without asking permission, carrying everyone in it along, and there was nothing spectacular about any of it, and there didn't need to be. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.